There is a particular kind of political decision that looks bold and decisive on the day it is made, and deeply, painfully costly in the weeks and months that follow. Panama just made one of those decisions. In January 2026, Panama's Supreme Court declared that a contract held by a Hong Kong-based Chinese company, a contract that had been legally signed, legally renewed, and legally operating for nearly 3 decades, was suddenly, retroactively, unconstitutional. No detailed explanation was offered. No specific constitutional clause was clearly identified. Just a ruling, delivered with the weight of judicial authority, that effectively stripped a major international company of port operating rights it had held since 1997. Within weeks, the Panamanian government had physically taken control of 2 of the most strategically important ports in the entire Panama Canal system. China, which had repeatedly asked for a clear, reasonable explanation and received nothing meaningful in return, began to respond. Not with diplomatic protests alone, not with strongly worded statements that would be filed and forgotten, with concrete, targeted, economically significant actions that struck directly at Panama's most vital commercial interests. Chinese shipping companies began redirecting vessels away from Panamanian ports. The Chinese government summoned the chief executives of 2 of the world's largest shipping companies, companies that had just been handed the operating rights of the ports Panama seized, for closed-door meetings in Beijing. And economists began calculating what it would mean for Panama to lose Chinese shipping traffic. Their estimate was a minimum of $4 billion per year. $4 billion. For a small Central American nation whose entire economic identity is built around the world's most famous waterway, that number is not an abstraction. It is an existential threat to government revenues, to employment, to the country's role in global trade. So how did Panama end up here? What was it actually thinking when it made this decision? And what does this confrontation reveal about the larger forces, American pressure, Chinese economic power, and the fragility of international contracts that are reshaping global commerce right now? Welcome to Frontline Reports. I'm Nico, and tonight we're going to take you through the full story of the Panama port dispute, from the original contract signed in 1997, through the legal and political earthquake of early 2026, to the economic war that is now quietly playing out across some of the world's most important shipping lanes. To appreciate what's at stake in this dispute, you first need to understand just how consequential Panama is as a node in the global trading system. Because its physical size, roughly 77,000 square kilometers, a country smaller than the state of South Carolina, gives absolutely no indication of the outsized role it plays in moving the world's goods. Panama's importance rests almost entirely on a single engineering marvel, the Panama Canal. Opened in 1914 after a decade of construction that cost tens of thousands of lives and billions of dollars, the Panama Canal is one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in human history. It does something deceptively simple. It connects the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean through an 80-kilometer corridor of locks, lakes, and channels cut through the narrow isthmus of Central America. That connection sounds straightforward. What it means in practice is revolutionary. Without the canal, a ship traveling from the eastern coast of the United States to ports in Asia would need to navigate all the way around Cape Horn, the treacherous southern tip of South America, which is honestly one of the most challenging stretches of open ocean on Earth. That journey adds approximately 15,000 additional kilometers to the route and transforms a 20-day voyage into a 35-day odyssey. For global shipping companies operating hundreds of vessels on tight schedules with fuel costs that run into hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage, that difference is not a minor inconvenience. It is the difference between a profitable route and an economically unviable one. The numbers generated by this shortcut are, frankly, staggering in their scale. Approximately 5% of all global maritime trade passes through the Panama Canal. More than 14,000 ships transit the waterway annually. The canal generates roughly $5 billion in total revenue each year, with toll fees alone accounting for more than $3 billion of that figure. These revenues fund a significant portion of the Panamanian government's budget, support tens of thousands of jobs across the canal's extensive ecosystem of port operations, logistics services, and ancillary businesses, and underpin Panama's identity as one of Latin America's more prosperous and economically dynamic small nations. Because of all this, the Panama Canal has always been more than an engineering achievement or a commercial asset. It is a geopolitical prize, a piece of infrastructure whose control carries strategic implications that extend far beyond the toll revenues it generates. The United States understood this from the canal's earliest days. Beginning in 1903, Washington exercised control over the canal and the surrounding zone for nearly a century. It was not until 1999, following the implementation of the 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties, negotiated under President Jimmy Carter, that Panama formally assumed full sovereignty over the waterway. That transfer was, for Panama, a moment of profound national significance. The canal was finally fully Panamanian. But the handover also marked the beginning of a new era of international commercial activity around the canal. And one of the most significant early participants in that new era was a Hong Kong-based company that arrived in Panama just 2 years before the handover was complete. In 1997, C.K. Hutchison Holdings, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate with extensive global port operations, entered into a formal agreement with the Panamanian government to assume operating rights for 2 ports located at the most strategic positions in the entire canal system. The port of Balboa, situated at the Pacific entrance to the canal, and the port of Cristobal, positioned at the Atlantic entrance. These are not peripheral facilities. They are, in functional terms, the twin gatekeepers of the Panama Canal, the first and last points of contact for vessels entering and exiting the waterway from both oceans. Together, they handle approximately 39% of Panama's total container throughput. They serve as critical logistics hubs not just for Panama but for the broader regional supply chain that connects North America, South America, and global markets. The contractual terms under which C.K. Hutchison assumed these operating rights were clearly defined. The agreement was structured as a 50-year arrangement, an initial fixed term of 25 years, automatically renewable for a further 25 years. Based on these terms, the contract was originally set to run until 2047. Over the nearly 3 decades that followed the signing of that agreement, C.K. Hutchison invested heavily in developing the port facilities it operated. Total investment in construction, expansion, equipment upgrades, and operational infrastructure exceeded $1.8 billion. The ports were modernized, their capacity was expanded, and their operational efficiency was improved substantially from the condition in which C.K. Hutchison had originally assumed them. By any conventional assessment of international business relationships, this looked like exactly the kind of long-term, capital-intensive foreign investment that developing nations actively compete to attract. A major international company committing nearly $2 billion to infrastructure in your country over decades, creating jobs and generating economic activity in the process. For nearly 28 years, the arrangement appeared to function without fundamental crisis. And then came 2025, and everything changed. The process by which Panama moved from a stable, long-standing contractual relationship with C.K. Hutchison to an outright legal annulment of that contract unfolded with remarkable speed. To understand what drove Panama's decision, you have to look at the political environment that had been building around the canal for the preceding year. The return of Donald Trump to the American presidency in January 2025 brought with it a sharp escalation in Washington's rhetorical and diplomatic posture toward Chinese commercial presence in Panama. Trump had expressed publicly, on multiple occasions, deep dissatisfaction with the 1999 canal handover. More specifically, he had repeatedly flagged Chinese companies operating port facilities in Panama as a national security concern, arguing that Chinese presence at both ends of the canal represented an unacceptable strategic vulnerability for the United States. These were not idle comments. They reflected a broader pattern of American pressure on Panama to reduce Chinese commercial involvement in canal-adjacent infrastructure. Washington made its position clear through diplomatic channels. The United States expected Panama to take action. Panama found itself in an uncomfortable position that many small nations adjacent to great powers know well. Geographically, economically, and historically, Panama's relationship with the United States is foundational to its security and its economic model. The dollar is Panama's currency. American investment is deeply embedded in its financial system. And the United States remains Panama's most powerful diplomatic partner. Against that background, resisting sustained American pressure on a specific policy question, however legitimate Panama's contractual obligations to C.K. Hutchison might be, was politically difficult. In 2025, the Panamanian government launched a formal investigation into C.K. Hutchison's port contracts. The investigation proceeded through Panama's judicial system, and on January 29, 2026, Panama's Supreme Court delivered its ruling. The contract was declared unconstitutional and therefore invalid. The court's publicly stated rationale was that the original agreement violated Panama's constitution. What it did not do, and this absence is significant, was specify clearly and precisely which constitutional provisions had been violated, or explain in detail how a contract that had been legally operative for 28 years had somehow been in breach of constitutional requirements, all along without anyone noticing or raising legal objections during that entire period. The ruling landed in international legal and diplomatic circles with considerable force, not because anyone was unfamiliar with the concept of judicial review of contracts, but because the combination of the vague constitutional justification, the timing, and the context of sustained American pressure made it very difficult to see this as a straightforward legal determination rather than a politically motivated judicial act. Less than a month later, on February 23, 2026, the Panamanian government moved beyond the legal sphere and into the physical one. Government officials formally assumed direct operational control of the port of Balboa and the port of Cristobal. Panama had not merely invalidated a contract, it had seized the facilities. C.K. Hutchison Holdings did not accept what had happened quietly or passively. Within days of Panama's takeover of the ports, the company issued a formal public statement characterizing Panama's unilateral cancellation of the contract as illegal expropriation of private property. The language was direct and legally significant. Expropriation is a specific term in international investment law with established frameworks for compensation and dispute resolution that Panama would now have to contend with. C.K. Hutchison initiated formal international arbitration proceedings, filing claims against Panama and seeking approximately $2 billion in compensation, a figure broadly corresponding to the total investment the company had made in developing the port facilities over nearly 3 decades. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for its part, issued public statements expressing clear support for C.K. Hutchison's pursuit of its legitimate rights through international legal mechanisms. The official position was measured in its language but unambiguous in its meaning. Beijing viewed Panama's actions as unjustifiable, and it expected the international arbitration process to provide an appropriate remedy. But more than a month passed after the port seizure. Panama provided no clear public explanation of its constitutional reasoning. No meaningful negotiation channel opened. The Panamanian government continued pushing forward with the physical takeover and began arrangements to transfer operational management of the 2 ports to new operators. That is the point at which China's response moved from the diplomatic and legal track to something considerably more direct and economically targeted. As the dispute entered its 2nd month without resolution, Chinese shipping companies began making operational decisions that reflected the changed political environment in a very tangible way. Among the most significant of these was the position taken by COSCO Shipping, one of the world's largest shipping conglomerates and a state-linked Chinese enterprise. Reports indicated that COSCO had suspended a portion of its cargo handling operations at the port of Balboa, while simultaneously undertaking a comprehensive review of its port-of-call arrangements across multiple shipping routes that had previously included Panamanian stops. On the morning that COSCO's operational notice went out, clients and logistics partners received emails instructing them to redirect empty container movements to alternative ports, specifically Manzanillo in Mexico and Colón in Panama's own free trade zone. The notice offered no explanation of why the change was being made, no indication of whether the adjustment was temporary or permanent, and no timeline for any potential reversal. What it left behind at the port of Balboa was visible in striking rows of empty berths, where days before, vessels had been docked and working. To understand why this matters so deeply to Panama, it's important to grasp something fundamental about how ports actually generate economic value. A port is not valuable simply because it exists. It is not valuable because it has cranes, container yards, deep water berths, and warehousing facilities, though all of those things matter. A port's value is determined almost entirely by one thing: whether shipping companies choose to bring their vessels there. This sounds obvious, but its implications are profound. A port that shipping companies stop visiting is not a port that generates reduced revenue. It is a port that becomes progressively more insolvent as its fixed costs, maintenance, labor, utilities, equipment servicing, debt payments on infrastructure investments, continue to accumulate against declining or disappearing income. The economic ripple effects extend well beyond the port gates themselves. When vessels call at a port, they generate spending across a wide ecosystem of local businesses and service providers. Crews purchase supplies, food, and services in the surrounding area. Ships require provisions, maintenance, and fuel. Logistics companies, customs brokers, truck drivers, warehouse workers, and dozens of other categories of employment depend directly on port traffic volumes. When the ships stop coming, all of that economic activity diminishes alongside the port's direct revenue. For Panama, a country whose entire economic identity and international relevance is constructed around its role as a global maritime hub, the prospect of major shipping companies systematically reducing or eliminating their engagement with Panamanian ports is not merely a commercial inconvenience. It is a threat to the foundational premise of the country's economic model. On March 6, 2026, the Chinese government made a move that sent an unmistakable signal about the seriousness of its response to Panama's actions, and about the sophistication of the pressure it intended to apply. Senior Chinese government officials summoned the leadership of two of the world's most powerful shipping companies to formal meetings in Beijing. The first was Maersk, the Danish company that is the world's second-largest container shipping operator, with a fleet of hundreds of vessels and commercial relationships spanning virtually every major trade lane on Earth. The second was Mediterranean Shipping Company, universally known in the industry as MSC, a Swiss-headquartered firm that had, as of 2023, surpassed Maersk to become the world's largest container shipping company by fleet capacity. The choice of these two companies was not random. It was precise and purposeful. Following Panama's seizure of the port of Balboa and the port of Cristobal, the Panamanian government had moved to transfer operational management of the two facilities to new operators. The entities selected to assume those operational rights were Maersk and MSC, the same two companies that China had now called in for talks. The specific content of what was discussed in those Beijing meetings has not been made public. No official transcript has been released. Neither Maersk nor MSC has disclosed in detail what was communicated to them by Chinese government representatives. But the identity of the participants, the timing of the meetings, and the broader context made the message essentially self-evident to anyone watching from the shipping industry or the diplomatic community. China was making clear, through direct private conversation, that companies benefiting from port arrangements that had been created through what Beijing characterized as the illegal expropriation of Chinese corporate assets. Some observers might question whether summoning European shipping companies to Beijing is an effective response to a dispute with Panama, a Central American government. To those observers, the answer lies in understanding the financial geography of global shipping. Maersk and MSC are not primarily European companies in terms of their revenue sources. They are global commercial enterprises whose profitability depends fundamentally on their access to the Chinese market. Consider Maersk's exposure. The company's revenues from Latin America, the entire region, including Panama, account for approximately 1/10 of its total global income. Its cargo volumes from China, by contrast, represent roughly 30% of total revenue. When you look at those numbers side by side, the asymmetry of leverage becomes immediately apparent. China is not asking Maersk to make a small commercial sacrifice in exchange for a large political gesture. China is asking Maersk to weigh a relatively modest portion of its revenue, the Latin American share, against the potential implications for the 30% share that flows from Chinese market access. For a publicly listed company with shareholders expecting consistent returns, that calculus is not difficult to work through. The same logic applies with equal or greater force to MSC, which operates extensive shipping routes that move Chinese manufactured goods to markets across the globe on a daily basis. Any disruption to MSC's Chinese route network, its port cooperation agreements in China, or its operational permissions in the Chinese market would represent a far more financially damaging outcome than any benefit the company might derive from operating 2 ports in Panama. Beyond the financial arithmetic, there is an industry dynamics dimension that amplifies China's leverage considerably. Maersk and MSC, between them, control approximately 1/3 of the world's total container shipping capacity. These are not simply large companies. They are companies whose port selection decisions and shipping route configurations function as benchmarks for the broader industry. When Maersk and MSC choose or decline to call at a particular port, other shipping companies pay attention, and many adjust their own decisions accordingly. If these 2 industry leaders were to significantly reduce their engagement with Panama's seized ports, the downstream effect on those ports' traffic volumes would be multiplied by the decisions of dozens of other carriers, reassessing their own routing strategies in response. For any global shipping company, unimpeded access to Chinese ports, Chinese cargo volumes, and Chinese market permits is a commercial necessity, not a preference. The Chinese market is the origin or destination of a larger share of global manufactured goods than any other single economy on Earth. You cannot build a viable global container shipping business while being effectively excluded from Chinese market participation. This is the lever China chose to apply, and it is in the context of global commercial. While the commercial and diplomatic pressures were building in real time, a parallel battle was taking shape in the quieter but equally consequential arena of international legal proceedings. C.K. Hutchison's decision to initiate international arbitration was not merely a procedural formality. It was the activation of a legal mechanism with potentially serious implications for Panama's financial position. Implications that extend well beyond the immediate question of compensation for the seized port operations. To understand why, you need to understand how international commercial arbitration actually works, and what it can compel countries to do. The enforcement of international arbitration decisions in commercial disputes is governed primarily by what is known as the New York Convention, formerly the United Nations Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards. Adopted in 1958 and now ratified by more than 160 countries, the New York Convention covers essentially every significant financial center and every major economy in the world. Under the convention's framework, when an international arbitration panel issues a ruling determining that one party owes compensation to another, the winning party can take that ruling to courts in any member country and request judicial enforcement. Courts in member countries are generally obligated to honor and enforce valid international arbitration awards, subject to a limited set of narrow exceptions. In practical terms, this means something very significant for Panama. If the arbitration panel, reviewing C.K. Hutchison's $2 billion compensation claim against Panama, determines that the claim is valid, C.K. Hutchison would have the legal authority to apply for enforcement in every major financial center on Earth. This includes, critically, the countries and financial jurisdictions where Panama holds its overseas assets. As of mid-2025, public data indicated that Panama's overseas creditor assets, funds and financial holdings that Panama maintains in foreign countries, totaled approximately $41.5 billion. Of that, roughly $13 billion was held in the United States. The remaining $28.5 billion was distributed across various European and Latin American financial centers. These overseas asset holdings are not merely financial reserves that Panama maintains for abstract investment purposes. They are operationally critical to Panama's government functions. They support the liquidity and cash management operations that enable the government to meet its regular spending obligations. Civil service, say,